Um, I now get to introduce Dr. John Newton. Dr. Newton has been the American Farm Bureau Federation's chief economist since 2018. As chief economist, Dr. Newton manages Farm Bureau's five-person economics department and is responsible for the American Farm Bureau's economic policy analysis. In this role, he advises Farm Bureau grassroots members, state staff, AFBF staff, and AFBF leadership on the economic implications of agricultural policy issues and proposals to help advance the organization's advocacy efforts. Welcome, Dr. Newton.
Thanks so much, Charlie. Can you hear me?
We can.
All right. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to be with you guys. Looks like there's 235 participants on the line, so that's absolutely fantastic. And before I get into my formal remarks, I want to let everyone know I want to entertain as many questions as I can at the conclusion of the presentation. And while the presentation is primarily on some of the economic issues that we've seen over the last few years in agriculture and provide a brief commentary on where we may go in 2021. I want to let folks know that there's no question that's off the table. Anything you'd like to know from a policy perspective, or how things are going with the transition team, what we may see with Secretary Vilsack, who was recently announced to take over USDA. I'm happy to provide perspective on any of those issues and answer any question. I want to be as helpful as I can to you all during your conference today. So I look forward to those questions at the end of this presentation. I think, going into 2020, we knew that we had been in for, at least 7 years, a downturn, a prolonged downturn in the farm economy. Commodity prices, especially for corn, soybeans, wheat, dairy commodity prices as well, were all well below their historical highs. And that resulted in a pretty steep decline in net farm income. In 2019, net farm income in Minnesota compared to the prior decade average was down 60%. In Iowa, it was down 40%. So we know it's been a pretty tough go in the farm economy the last few years with low commodity prices. In addition to low commodity prices, we faced increasing natural disasters. You can see in some of these Minnesota counties, you had natural disasters impact you in both 2018 and 2019. We had historic flooding across the country in 2019, a historically late planted crop in 2019. We've had several hurricanes come up the Gulf and along the East Coast. I was visiting with our North Carolina Farm Bureau members prior to the pandemic, and they had said we had two 1,000-year floods 2 years in a row. So we've obviously been facing more natural disasters, making it even tougher to navigate the tough farm economy that we find ourselves in. Last year, we had 20 million acres qualified to use prevent plant because of the historic flooding that we saw across the country. Southwest Minnesota obviously had a lot of acres that qualified for prevent plant coverage in 2019. We still had a lot of prevent plant coverage in 2020 as well, primarily in the Prairie pothole region there in the Dakotas. But in a normal year, we have somewhere around 5 to 6 million acres of prevent plant. In 2019, we had a record 20 million acres. And this year, as of late summer, we already had more than 9 million acres go unplanted this year. So pretty tough growing seasons the last few years. The other obvious challenge that we have been facing the last few years was retaliatory tariffs from China. They had put tariffs on just about 99% of the products that we ship to China every single year. So we saw exports in 2018 and 2019 to China decline significantly. Our export decline resulted in our trade surplus. And now we've had a trade surplus for some 40 years. We had our trade surplus in 2019 among one of the lowest levels that we've seen in 40 years, again, because of the retaliatory tariffs that we saw from China. So coming into 2020, when you think about what this administration had done from a trade perspective, renegotiating USMCA, the US-Japan agreement, chorus, and obviously the phase one agreement with China, I think folks were optimistic that 2020 was finally, we were going to turn the corner. It was going to be a better year. We were looking for trade to rebound and really help to lift our commodity prices this year. We knew we were going to see an expansion in corn and soybean acres after 2019, and we did see an increase in soybean acres primarily. This year, corn acres came in around 90, 91 million acres. I think soybeans jumped to around 84 million acres. And then we saw wheat acres this year come in at slightly less than 45 million acres. But again, I think we knew that we were going to have bigger crops on our hands in 2020. So this year, in terms of a farm income perspective, was shaping up very early on to be a race between supply and demand. And that is, could demand accelerate enough to offset the additional supplies that we knew was coming back in 2020? For the most part, we've seen that on our crop yields as well. Corn yields were up this year to 176 bushels per acre, soybeans at 51 bushels per acre. We did see a slight pullback on wheat yields. They're at 49.7 bushels per acre. And then we saw some improvement on the cotton side prior to today's WASDE. Today's WASDE updated those cotton yields pretty significantly down to 850 pounds per acre. But we expected bigger crops this year, so demand was going to be critically important to boosting farm prices. On the livestock side, we were also expecting pretty significant red meat production. Beef production was expected to increase. Pork production was expected to increase. Poultry production was expected to be. Says somebody can't hear me. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, John.
Okay, the Q&A said, is the presenter's mic muted? So, okay, sorry about that. Poultry production was expected to be record high this year, and then milk production was expected to be record high, more than 220 billion pounds of milk. So whether it was on the crop side or on the livestock side, we knew production was going to be significant. So we were hoping that the improved access that we had in USMCA, the improved access we had on the China phase one agreement and their purchase commitments was going to help lift prices this year. Unfortunately, that light that we thought we saw at the end of the tunnel turned out to be a freight train. And this chart here shows the daily change in new confirmed cases of the coronavirus. And it's hard to imagine where we are today with more than 250,000 new confirmed cases every single day. But this virus really has significantly impacted food and agriculture in a way that we just could not simply have anticipated in early March. I remember at the Farm Bureau National Convention back in January, this was primarily a Chinese issue. And I don't, unfortunately, I don't think many people at that point in time ever thought that this could become a global issue and what it could potentially do not only to the agricultural sector, but to economies around the world. For food and ag, one of the first things, I'll talk about the supply chain disruptions here in just a minute. One of the first things that we had to do was make sure that farmers across the country had access to the labor that they needed. So as COVID-19 was, we had lockdown orders, shelter-in-place orders, stay-at-home orders. The borders were shut down. We immediately went to work with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to make sure that our guest worker programs and those employees could continue to come across the border, help us harvest our winter crops and get our spring crops in the ground. But what we began to see in the days and weeks that followed our effort around ag labor was the fact that in 2018, we spent nearly $2 trillion on food, and more than half of that occurred outside the home, food away from home consumption. So when you shut down schools, when you shut down restaurants, when you shut down leisure and hospitality, all of a sudden you have a whole supply chain that was built to supply that food service industry that needs to be rerouted, and it can't be rerouted very quickly. So you had dairy farmers that had to dump milk. You had folks that were growing specialty crops, plowing those under into the field. And if you think about, just as an example, a restaurant's not buying 1 pound of bacon at a time. they're buying 50-pound packages of bacon. Well, all of a sudden, if the restaurant's closed, they don't need 50-pound packages of bacon, and you can't exactly refabricate a supply line to turn those packaging systems into 1-pound packaging systems. So we had a lot of issues in the short term around the food supply chain, making sure that consumers had enough food and trying to divert the supply chain from our restaurant space into our grocery channel. We saw grocery store sales hit a record, $73 billion in March as the pandemic set in. At the same time, we saw food service and drinking sales plummet very, very rapidly from March to April, a decline, somewhere in the neighborhood of 80–90%. So very, very significant decline in food service and drinking sales. If we look at where we are today, we have recovered somewhat, but I think as we move forward, we see more local governments and states issue additional lockdown orders, additional restrictions on in-person dining capacity. We could see food service and drinking sales somewhat slow down a little bit. Now consumers are spending more at the grocery store, but that is going to have an impact on food and agriculture as we work our way past the virus. What we also saw with COVID-19 were significant disruptions in our meat packing plants. So at first, workers weren't showing up because they were afraid of getting sick. And so we were running at less than full capacity because you didn't have full employment in the facilities. And then as workers got sick, as plants shut down to not only clean and quarantine the facility, but also to install personal protective equipment, we had meat packing plants around the country go down for 14-day periods. At one point in time this spring, both beef and pork production were down more than 30% year over year. That created two different scenarios. On the retail side, you had a shortage of meat coming out of the back of the plant. So retail prices were going through the roof. So food price inflation at the grocery store was 6–7% year over year, even higher than that for some items like eggs or beef or poultry products. At the same time, you had farmers with market ready livestock without a place to go. So the farm prices were dropping rapidly. If you looked at the farm share of the beef retail dollar this past spring, it was around 32–33%, which is the lowest all time. And that's a reflection of the low fat cattle prices and the record high beef prices that we saw in the store. The beef and pork processing have mostly recovered. On the beef side, we're slaughtering heavier animals. So when you look at annual beef production, we're actually going to be slightly higher than last year, even though we had this significant disruption earlier in the year. Same on the pork side, we're processing more animals now. We're making up that backlog. So I think both beef and pork production, they're going to be higher than where they were in 2019, probably not as high as they would have been had we not experienced COVID-19. The impact on commodity prices were significant. Doesn't matter what you had. Hog prices were down at one point more than 50%. Class 4 milk prices, which is butter and powder, were down 25%. Because people weren't driving, gasoline demand was down. We also had a Russia-Saudi Arabian oil war at the same time. Everybody probably remembers when May oil futures traded to negative $25 a barrel. So with oil demand down, that means ethanol demand was down. Ethanol prices were down 25%. That means the ethanol plants are idle in their capacity. That means they're not buying as much corn for feedstock. So you saw corn prices drop. People aren't buying as much clothing because we're in a recession. So you see cotton prices drop. I talked about live cattle. Wheat prices were down. Imagine trying to market your wheat in this type of volatile environment. Just about everything saw some disruption in their prices as a result of COVID-19. In response, on the Hill, we saw the CARES Act and was ultimately signed by the president in March that provided the Office of the Secretary $23.5 billion. It was staggered, so they got $9.5 right up front, and then another $14 billion later in the summer. I believe around July or August is when that CCC replenishment occurred. The administration was able to use that to craft two different COVID-19 relief packages, CFAP 1 and CFAP 2. I believe CFAP 1 has paid out around $11 billion, and CFAP 2, as of the beginning of this week, has paid out about $12 billion in support. Minnesota, Iowa, Nebraska, Illinois, and California are among the leaders in COVID-19 assistance. Minnesota's received about $743 million in CFAP 2 support. There's probably another, $1.5 to $2 billion left in CFAP money. The sign up for CFAP, if you haven't signed up yet, is the deadline's tomorrow. I don't know if anybody, Minnesota's a big dairy state. The deadline for the dairy sign up is tomorrow as well. But so far, about $740 million has gone to Minnesota farmers to help them bridge the gap due to COVID-19 issues. If you take MFP1, MFP2, CFAP1, CFAP2, not including WIP, the disaster programs, not including the Paycheck Protection Program, the administration over the last several years has provided more than $42 billion in ad hoc support. And again, that also doesn't include traditional farm bill programs like ARC and PLC or the Conservation Reserve Program. So as of November 15th, Minnesota had received more than $3 billion since 2018 in ad hoc support. Iowa leads the country at nearly 4.5 billion, Illinois at 3.7 billion, Nebraska at 2.9 billion. So again, a lot of ad hoc support has gone out to the farm sector the last few years to help them offset the losses as a result of unfair retaliatory tariffs and the COVID-19 pandemic. One of the other areas that we've seen an impact of COVID-19 this year is on agricultural trade. Just about in all of our markets. And I mentioned how we had renegotiated trade with Japan, South Korea, our North American partners, and China. Exports to Mexico are down 1.6 billion through October. And a matter of fact, if you look at total agricultural exports to Mexico through October, it's the lowest level that it's been in a decade. So that's a reflection of the economic challenges that they're facing there. It impacts their purchasing capacity of our agricultural products because of the COVID-19 recession. Sales to Japan are down nearly more than $500 million. Sales to the European Union plus UK are down nearly $1 billion. Sales to Canada are down 300 million. The lone bright spot in the world right now is China. And sales to China are up nearly $7 billion compared to 2019. And that's in large part due to multiple things. First, African swine fever that they experienced, I believe in August of 2018, is when the first case of ASF was discovered in China. So they've had a very, very strong demand for our protein products. They bought a lot of beef, a lot of pork, a lot of poultry. That certainly helped. Second, as their hog herd has started to rebuild this year, we're seeing them buy a large amount of soybeans. Third, they've got the corn crop in China is in pretty tough conditions based on anecdotal reports, and so they're going to import a record amount of corn from the United States. And then fourth, the phase one agreement. They made a number of structural changes to facilitate improved imports of U.S. agricultural products. And so at this point, through October, we've seen very, very strong export commitments of corn and soybeans, 3.5 billion bushels on the books for corn and soybeans to be exported to China. The phase one through October, we're at 17.6 or $17.5 billion, which is about 28% below the pace needed to meet the phase one goals. But at the same time, in October, they bought nearly $5 billion worth of agricultural products from the United States. That's very significant. That's a record. They've never bought that much from us in a single month. And again, that's on the back of the very strong demand that we've seen from them and the phase one agreement. So if they continue along this pace, my guess is that we'll see somewhere in the neighborhood of $25 to $30 billion worth of product purchased by China, exported to China during calendar year 2020. USDA and USTR estimated about 24 billion in U.S. agricultural exports back in October. But again, I think we've seen some very, very strong exports recently to China, which is going to help that number. While it won't hit the phase one goal, it's likely to still be record high. When you take the record amount of exports that are likely and you combine them with the structural changes that the Chinese have made as far as the phase one agreement, it's certainly a step in the right direction. President-elect Biden has indicated that he's going to keep the tariffs on China, and he's indicated that he wants to review the phase one agreement. I think where the agricultural community is going to come from is we want to see the gains that we've made on the phase one agreement remain. We want to continue to make China be a good and fair trading partner. So we want to see, everything that we've accomplished on the phase one, and then we want to see a phase two process move forward that can accomplish some additional gains with trade with China. If we look again where we are currently through October, the strongest exports that we've seen to China since 2014. So again, if this pace continues, we're very likely to be close to a record high. So very, very successful so far is the phase one agreement with China. Again, we're not going to hit the target, but we are certainly going to be in better shape than we had been the last few years. What we've seen as well since August, on the back of the strong demand, we've also seen the crop has gotten smaller. There have been some revisions to the stocks report and as well as some revisions to acreage and yields. So, in the spring, we thought we were going to have a corn carry out over 2 billion bushels, a soybean carry out, in the neighborhood of 400 or 500 million bushels. Now today we're sitting, I think USDA's latest WASDE says, less than 160 million bushels in soybean carry out, about 1.7 billion bushels in corn carry out. I think I saw wheat prices were up 16 cents this morning. I'm not sure where they ended the day, but we've seen prices really rebound and recover from where they were this summer. Milk prices are a lot stronger, at least through November. Soybean prices are stronger. Cotton prices are stronger. Corn prices are stronger. Across the board, most commodity prices are now in better shape than the COVID-19 back in March. For the year now, USDA expects wheat prices to jump 12 cents with an average marketing year price of $4.70 per bushel. They've got a corn price of $4 per bushel, a soybean price of $10.55 per bushel. Again, that's a marketing year average price, and a cotton price up about 4 cents to 64 cents a bushel. So higher crop prices is certainly going to help farm income, as well as the CFAP support that we've seen come in this year. And that kind of brings it to, what's the latest on the farm income outlook? What's the latest on net farm profitability? So this year, USDA updated their forecast on farm income last week. They now project for total cash receipts from crop and livestock sales at $367 billion. That's down $3 billion and the lowest level since 2016. In that $367 billion is $200 billion in crop cash receipts and $167 billion in livestock cash receipts. Cash receipts from crops are expected to be higher this year, again, due to the higher commodity prices that we've seen really since August. And on the livestock side, cash receipts are going to be slightly lower, and that's due to the low, fat cattle, feeder cattle, hog prices, and milk prices that we've seen on the livestock side. When you take into consideration, however, the ad hoc support, the farm bill payments through, conservation or ARC or PLC, or the dairy margin coverage program, government support in 2020 is projected to be nearly $47 billion. So even though our cash receipts from the market are going down, federal ad hoc support is going up. And so we're expected to see higher gross income in 2020. When you combine that with production expenses that are going down, they've declined by $5 billion from 2019. We're going to find ourselves with a farm profitability scenario that looks pretty darn good. across the country. And so when you take and subtract production expenses from gross income, USDA now projects for farm income in 2020, net farm income to be the second highest of all time. They're projecting it at $120 billion. That's second only to 2013, where we saw $124 billion in net farm income. Now, again, this is not adjusted for inflation. This is nominal terms. When we adjust for inflation, the last time we saw farm income at these levels prior to 2013 was back in the 70s. So, but what I've been telling folks is, while net farm income is the second highest of all time, it's not because we're getting that return out of the marketplace. Commodity prices haven't fully recovered. And so when you look at the percentage of federal support as a percent of net farm income, we're looking at 46.5 billion. That's nearly 40% of the $120 billion in net farm income. So I've told folks in the media the last week and a half or so that this farm income number we see is really a false positive. It's good news. People have some walking around money, but commodity prices still have not recovered to very high levels. What I think we're likely to see moving into 2021 is, assuming this demand rally continues, and hopefully it does, we're going to see higher commodity prices. We're going to see higher crop prices. We're going to see higher livestock prices, especially on the cattle side. I think we're looking at fat cattle prices around $114, $115 as the 5-area average. I think we're probably not going to see higher milk prices, likely to see higher pork prices if the demand continues there. So I think we're going to see higher commodity prices. But if you take 20, 30 billion away in ad hoc support, we could potentially see net farm income in 2021 drop considerably, maybe 15, 20, 25%, depending on where commodity prices ultimately end up. If demand continues to improve, I can see prices moving higher. As we move into the spring, these higher prices are going to send market signals. Folks are going to, alter their crop rotations to the best extent they can to plant what's likely to have higher returns per acre. We also, one other thing of note is the package being negotiated for the next stimulus package does include an additional $13 billion for agricultural relief related to COVID-19. We don't know how that money would be allocated or when that money would be spent, but the package does include additional stimulus for agriculture. The federal support this year is a percent of gross income. Again, it was nearly 40% of net farm income. It's going to be about 10% of gross income, which we haven't seen a level that high in all time. Again, not adjusted for inflation. So that's going to make for quite the conversation once we get towards this next Congress and working on the Farm Bill. And so, and there's no way to better demonstrate this than talk about the ad hoc support bubble. And what we've seen the last few years, the orange shaded area is MFP, the red shaded area is the CFAP and PPP and WIP program, ad hoc disaster assistance. Most of that is likely to go away next year. And so, again, I indicated this next stimulus package likely has about $13 billion in it, but we don't know how that will be allocated, if it'll be allocated, in what form. But we certainly can't count on, 40 billion, 60 billion in ad hoc support like we saw this year. I think what we've seen with this amount of federal support, it has helped keep land prices robust. I think I saw across portions of the Midwest that land values are actually going up. Farm bankruptcies through the first 3 quarters of this year are going down. And then cash rents still remain pretty strong. And I think, again, with the CFAP and MFP money that's come in, cash rents are still going to be pretty competitive, this fall going into next year. The conversation that's around the corner that we're all going to, continue to be engaged in is on climate. And when you look at agriculture and agriculture's share of greenhouse gas emissions, we're less than 10% of total U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. In the livestock sector, when you take manure management and enteric fermentation, the livestock sector is less than 4% of total greenhouse gas emissions. But there's going to be more and more emphasis in agriculture around what are we doing to capture and sink carbon in the soils? What are we doing to potentially become more neutral in terms of agriculture's greenhouse gas emissions? I think that in this next administration, there's going to be more of an effort to boost funding for climate smart adoption of climate smart technologies. More of an effort to boost conservation program funding so that we can do more for agriculture to capture carbon in the soil and potentially help agriculture. I think there's a stated goal from the dairy folks to go net zero by 2030. So that means more methane digesters, more cover crop adoption, things of that nature. So it's going to be more and more part of the conversation as we move forward. I think President-elect Biden made it very clear that his priority is going to be on domestic issues and on climate issues. Secretary Vilsack has made it very clear that there's a role to play for USDA on climate issues. The transition team led by Mr. Robert Bonney, who was formerly at NRCS, has also been very actively engaged on issues around climate. So I think it's going to be part of the conversation. I think all the ag groups recognize that, and we want to be part of the conversation. We want to be at the table with lawmakers as they're thinking about how we incentivize increased adoption of climate smart technologies. One of the things that we continue to say when we're at that table is that farmers are willing to do more, and we've long been good stewards of the land, protecting the water, protecting the air, protecting the soil, and we can do more, but it's got to be economically sustainable as well. And I think that's where there's more conversation around, well, can we do something like a carbon tax credit that's transferable? So that will be good for a farm operation. Can we boost funding in the farm bill through the conservation title to get more of these practices adopted? So again, I think we're at the table. We want to be part of the conversation to see how we can get more of these voluntary, not mandatory, but voluntary practices adopted across the country, and how we can create the proper incentives for folks to do that. So again, I've taken about 30 minutes. I wanted to leave plenty of time for questions. I put all of these slides up on my Twitter account. If you have Twitter, it's new10_ag-econ. You guys have copies of the slides, so feel free to distribute them. And I really do look forward to your questions, and you can ask questions about anything. It doesn't have to be something that was in this slide deck. I'm happy to answer any questions that you all may have. So thank you.
Hey, John, we got one question here. I'm not sure if you saw it or not, but if China does not meet phase 1 agreements, will tariffs be applied again and the trade war resume?
Well, the tariffs are still in place. Now, there are dispute settlement mechanisms within the phase 1 agreement. We just saw President-elect Biden tap somebody for USTR that's, is considered around town to be an expert on Chinese relations, but I don't, at this point, I don't think I know how they will approach this. I don't know if Ambassador Dowd had good insight to offer you all on that, but there are mechanisms in the phase 1 agreement to deal with that. But I think that'll be something that President-elect Biden and his team are going to have to address.
One more question for you here. Any news on wheat quality loss program for 2019 crop?
That's a great question. I don't have the answer to that, but do have a really good relationship with Martin over at RMA, and would be happy to connect with your team here in DC, Josh or Chandler, and get an answer for that and get it back to you guys. Would that work?
That'd be great. Thank you so much.
Yep.
Well, thank you, Dr. Newton. We really appreciate your insights and thank you for that great presentation.